We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 16th of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
This peace deal is about the so-called 5 territories, but there's so much more to it.
Will Ukraine cede territory in order to reach a deal with Russia? We'll get the latest on the conflict. China's president is on a South Asian charm offensive. We'll check on how his 3-nation tour is proceeding. We'll hear all about the unveiling of the Olympic and Paralympic torches for next year's Milano Cortina Winter Games. And we'll catch up with the ongoing travails of South Korea's leader. Then a check-in with the auto industry in Europe as US tariffs bite, and a roundup of retail and fashion news. Plus,
we are architects, so we do the design, but also we need to ensure that the design stacks up, the viability stacks up, and I am very aware that we need to be speaking the language of the people we want to convince.
The president of REBA gives us his insights on the future of cities. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Jordan has arrested 16 members of the Muslim Brotherhood, believed to have been planning an attack. After more than 3 years of negotiation, members of the World Health Organization reached an agreement to prepare the world for future pandemics. And US President Donald Trump threatened to strip Harvard of its tax-exempt status on Tuesday and said the university should apologize, a day after it rejected what it called unlawful demands to overhaul academic programs or lose federal grants. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. On Sunday, Russia launched a missile attack against the northeastern city of Sumy in Ukraine, killing 35 people and injuring 119. It marked one of the worst attacks against Sumy throughout the full-scale war and has sparked a number of other developments. Well, I'm joined now by Mark Galeotti, a political analyst and author of Putin's Wars, From Chechnya to Ukraine. Mark, firstly, why did the US block a G7 statement responding to this Sumy attack?
I mean, the most sort of kind interpretation is precisely that at the moment they're involved in high-stakes negotiations. Steve Witkoff has just been in Russia meeting with Putin and other officials, and that in some ways they just didn't want and again, this is not how I would characterize it, but a sort of a piece of breast-beating virtue signaling to get in the way of those negotiations. I mean, more broadly, I think it is also very clear that at the moment, Washington isn't really interested in looking to be on the side of Ukraine. As far as they're concerned, this is a practical problem to be solved rather than anyway a moral issue.
When we talk about peace talks, who's actually talking to whom? There seem to be many parallel discussions going on here.
Well, I think that's actually part of the whole design. I think the Americans had realized, in fairness, that trying to actually get Ukrainians to sit down with Russians in the current environment was just pointless. And so instead they have 2 tracks. So you have General Keith Kellogg, who is the American representative to Ukraine, who is talking to the Ukrainians and trying to get a sense of what they are and aren't willing to accept as a part of any deal. And then you have Steve Witkoff, who is talking to the Russians. The problems are twofold. One is that Witkoff seems to actually have very much a much more dominant role. Kellogg does seem to have been marginalized within the White House, and there is a suspicion that essentially his job is just simply to tell the Ukrainians what the White House wants them to do. And secondly, there is the fact that we're still not clear. At first, this was meant to be about just simply a ceasefire, which could then be a pause in which proper negotiations for a peace could be held. Now it looks increasingly as if the Russians are essentially saying, no, we need to actually have a proper full negotiation. We heard from Steve Witkoff that this wasn't just about peace in Ukraine, that they're also bringing all kinds of other issues to the table, particularly relating to NATO. And therefore, you might say that the whole nature of the peace talks is morphing on an almost daily basis. And so the idea that at some point you'll have some kind of working temporary agreement, at which point the Ukrainians and the Russians can be brought together, seems to be replaced by the idea, as we'd expected, that Trump thinks that essentially the Americans and the Russians can hammer out a deal and the Ukrainians will have to accept it. Of course, the Ukrainians do have a vote. They do have a veto.
And I mean, Witkoff seemed to imply that ceding territory may be the only way forward.
Yes, I mean, look, if we're absolutely honest, underneath all the current sort of rhetoric, there has been a widespread expectation that in practice, if not in law, the current occupied territories, which is about 20% of Ukraine, will probably not be regained, at the moment at least, by Kyiv. However, the Russians have been demanding more. The Russians have been demanding essentially that Ukraine recognize its annexation of these whole regions and, in effect, hand over territory, including major cities like Kherson, like Zaporizhia, without a fight. That's really not going to happen. So at the moment, it's very hard to see how this is a bridgeable gap.
And do you think that America will attempt to buy Russia off with various commercial deals? I mean, Witkoff did seem to be hinting at that. And if that were the case, how would any business agreement skirt sanction regulations?
Well, I mean, clearly sanctions regulations are imposed and they can be lifted. Of course, the interesting question is who is buying whom off? Because the Russians have also been trying to trail the possibility for all kinds of joint ventures, in particular exploitation of the resources that are becoming increasingly accessible, sadly, because of climate change in the Arctic. So in some ways, the fear is precisely that an American administration that really sees itself more than anything else as the sort of the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated is going to be so seduced by the prospect of some kind of economic deals with Russia that it is willing not only to essentially throw Ukraine under the proverbial bus, but also lift sanctions precisely so that American companies can get in there and start to exploit Russian opportunities.
And Mark, just before you go, I wonder if you could tell us more about the Chinese soldiers fighting for Russia.
I mean, I think there is a political dimension to this. We know that the Russians, just like the Ukrainians, have all sorts of non-nationals fighting in their armies. And what's come to light has been, for example, some of the recruiting adverts in Chinese that have been out on TikTok and other social media. So, it seems to be that these are just essentially individual Chinese who have chosen to sign up, seduced by the fairly massive bonuses that Moscow is willing to pay. Of course, the interesting thing is the way that Zelensky has been trying to spin this as signs that somehow Beijing is crucially involved in this war, precisely because it knows that for the current White House, China is the real threat, and therefore they're trying to basically play up the degree to which this is also a China problem in order to try and undermine Russia. It's not really working at the moment, but I think it's a strategy that we can expect the Ukrainians to be trying more in the future.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. That was Mark Galeotti there. This is The Globalist. It is 13:11 in Phnom Penh, 7:11 here in London. China's President Xi Jinping is in the midst of a tour to Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia, all countries that have been affected by US tariffs. It's his first overseas trip of the year and aims to, in Xi's words, resolutely safeguard the multilateral trading system. So is his charm offensive in the face of Washington's protectionism working? Well, I'm joined now by Bill Hayton, Associate Fellow at Chatham House's Asia Pacific programme. Bill, Trump's been flip-flopping wildly over tariffs. Just what is the situation now with China, Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia? Who is meant to pay what and for which goods?
Well, I mean, as you know, all of these things have been suspended or on pause for the time being. But I mean, it's important to realise that Cambodia and the original plan, Liberation Day, was the highest tariffed country at 49%, I think. Laos came second, and Vietnam was fourth. So he's seeing two of the four hardest hit countries from the American sanctions. Malaysia is quite a long way down the list. Only get a 24% tariff, I think. But also obviously massively at risk from the likely impact of these tariffs once they come back into force, as we assume they will.
I mean, the tour was actually announced before the tariffs were imposed. Has Xi's agenda changed in light of that? What is he actually after here?
I think that there's two things here. I mean, I suspect that there's a geopolitical agenda to the tariffs. I mean, quite why these countries have been singled out for the highest levels. They seem to me to be the countries that are in Southeast Asia that are swinging towards China or could do, and maybe Biden wants. Why did I say that? Maybe Trump wants to say do a deal on geopolitical terms. So these are kind of I suspect there's a kind of geopolitical edge to these Trump tariffs. But Xi is, I think, going there and offering an alternative, saying we can do a deal, multilateral trading order. The problem is for a country like Vietnam, and indeed, is that they rely on the US and to some extent the EU as the markets that soak up their exports. Vietnam has a massive trade deficit with China and a massive trade surplus with both the US and the EU, and it's clear, in some cases that's just avoiding the tariffs. Some Chinese companies were just sending stuff to Vietnam, sticking it in a different box and sending it on to the US. But that's less and less of an issue, I think. You're now getting more Chinese companies actually establishing production in Vietnam. But it's, you can see it as part of China's trade surplus with the US. So in that case, Vietnam's pretty squeezed. So even if China talks about upholding the rules-based multilateral, trading system, who's going to buy this stuff if it's not the United States? So Vietnam is in a tricky position, as are Cambodia and Malaysia.
I mean, Donald Trump says that China's working with Vietnam, trying to figure out how do we screw the United States of America, in his words. How possible is it that eventually the US could be cut out of the trade loop entirely?
Well, I mean, there's an awful lot of consumers in the US, and if China wants to be the pillar of the multilateral trading system, then it's got to turn its citizens into massive consumers and importers. They have to replace the United States as the people that buy the iPhones and the socks and all the things that these Southeast Asian countries make, and that's obviously a massive effort to transform the Chinese economy. So I think it's unlikely that they're going to do that. But there will, the theatre, the performance of China being benevolent, reaching out to help Southeast Asia at the same time as Donald Trump's America is slamming the door in their faces, will not be lost on leaders and publics in Southeast Asia.
And what have we learnt from the tour so far? I mean, we know that they were trying to sign around 40 agreements with Vietnam, for instance. I mean,
these kind of visits always come with huge numbers of agreements, often because things are backed up until these visits take place. So there's then a huge impact. The Chinese are very good at the theatre of this. But yeah, I mean, I think China is saying we are an all cross spectrum kind of friend on everything from trade to regional issues and health and things like that. So and it's really paying attention to these countries which are its neighbours or near neighbours, and showing full spectrum engagement, as you might say.
Has she been negotiating with other countries outside of Asia?
I mean, I think China is constantly looking for opportunities, and its diplomacy is about building partnerships. I mean, China has an allergy to alliances. It doesn't want to be sort of tied into doing things on behalf of other countries ever. But it's very much in terms of flexible partnerships. And these obviously are, the Belt and Road Initiative is the one that everybody has heard about. It's a slogan. It means lots of different things in lots of different places. But it's become a kind of a rubric under which China engages. South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands. If the US is now at a point when it's just turning inwards and abandoning, the idea of international engagement, when it's a kind of, it's pretty much a free run for China, unless, countries in the EU or the EU collectively and some other states, Japan, India are also big players, unless they step up to kind of give these countries choices.
I mean, I wonder where it does leave nations and blocs like the EU who'd prefer not to be reliant on either China or the US.
Well, indeed, the EU and Europeans generally, we are between a rock and a hard place. I was at a conference a few weeks ago when someone talked about there now being 3 rogue states in the world, China, Russia, and the United States. And what does the EU do, about that kind of lonely position? I think the Japanese are keen to work with the EU. I mean, India isn't exactly a paragon of free trade, but it's talking about some kind of various free trading arrangements. Trying to kind of play on that playing field and salvage what's left of the multilateral trading order. The EU was in Samarkand in Central Asia just last week or the week before. So, looking to see if it can engage there. So I think it's looking for opportunities, but, does it have to wait? Does it have the growth of, China and the US? Not at the moment.
I wonder if anything can be decided while the goalposts are still shifting. I mean, can we ever expect a definitive US position on tariffs, or will they'll always be up for negotiations as nations flit in and out of favour with Trump, depending on his mood, it would appear?
Yeah, I mean, looking at this, it looks like Trump has clearly gone for the quotes madman theory of international relations. You never know what he's going to do next. Keep your opponents off balance all the time. So what people can sneer at the flip flopping and the lack of intellectual cohesion here, but I mean there is geopolitical method in his apparent madness, and if you look at the list of the countries that are targeted, I think he has, in terms of the tariffs, I think he clearly wants concessions from these countries, and the power of the United States as a market is sufficient, I think, to make sure that people will try and generate some kind of concessions, whether they be on trade and business or whether they be on geopolitical terms, so that he feels he gets a win. So, and this, this period of suspension at the moment, I think, is a time when all states will be trying to do that. I mean, under Trump 1, Vietnam was very successful in avoiding, the eye of Sauron as it swept across the landscape. But and it did clever things like buying a lot of American liquefied natural gas and other things to try and show that it was putting money into the US economy. But clearly Trump felt that Vietnam had got away with too much under his first administration, and is clearly in his sort of target sites for the second administration.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. That's Bill Hayton there. Now, still to come on the programme.
I'm looking at something to help some of the car companies where they're switching to parts that were made in Canada, Mexico, and other places, and they need a little bit of time.
So how are Trump's tariffs affecting the auto manufacturers? We'll find out. This is The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio is Claudine Fry, partner at Control Risk. Good morning to you, Claudine.
Good morning.
Let's pick up on something we've been reporting in our headlines. This is the story coming out of Jordan, which says it's uncovered an Islamist plot to build weapons and sow chaos.
Yes, this is a piece from the Washington Post, quoting a statement from the General Intelligence Department in Jordan, which reports that for a number of years now, it has been monitoring some individuals who have been plotting in various ways to destabilise the country, including manufacturing and using rockets and drones in the kingdom. It reports that 16 nationals, Jordanian nationals, are now in detention, some of which are linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist organisation with a presence right across the Middle East. That organisation has actually, its Jordanian branch actually has come out and denied that it has any connection to the activities that the intelligence department has reported this week.
And they've been monitoring this group, though, for some time and, in fact, already picked up some members.
That's right. A number of whom are in detention, and there has been a release of a supposed sort of confession by a couple of the individuals who are in detention who indicate that they were indeed planning to recruit, fund and operate in a way that would pose a threat to stability within Jordan. Jordan, of course, is one of the most stable countries in the region, but has a long history of becoming a home to people fleeing instability elsewhere. And so this uncovering of this plot is a reminder of sort of underlying sources of fragility within even Jordan.
Now, the situation in Sudan continues to worsen. The FT has a big splash on this today.
That's right. Absolutely horrific humanitarian crisis unfolding in Sudan, which is receiving extraordinarily little attention, sadly. But yes, this FT piece is reporting on something that actually happened a few days ago and has been reported elsewhere as well. An attack by militants on two refugee camps in Darfur. And an NGO, the Relief International organisation, actually confirmed that, sadly, its entire staff of 9 were killed in a medical clinic at one of the refugee camps. So real illustration of just how severe the humanitarian crisis is in Sudan. But the FT piece was also timed to coincide with the fact that the UK has just hosted an international conference aimed at trying to revive diplomatic activity around resolving the conflict. But sadly, it didn't produce an enormous amount. Certainly, aid pledges far, far lower than the billions of dollars that the UN has been calling for. So sort of an illustration itself, I think, of the sort of desperate plight facing Sudan.
Now, off the back of the story we've been reporting about Harvard and how it's going to lose its tax-exempt status, Canadian universities report a jump in US applicants.
Yeah, this is a piece from The Guardian, which is reporting some information that we're receiving from Canadian universities, yes, as you say. The University of British Columbia, the Vancouver campus, has said this week that it's reporting a 27% jump in applications as of the 1st of March from US citizens for studies that would start later this year. The University of Toronto and the University of Waterloo, also in Canada, also reporting much more interest from American students. It's not clear from the University of Toronto information if we're talking here about US nationals or perhaps about foreign nationals in the United States who are rethinking whether they want to continue being there in the context of Trump's moves against both universities and immigrants, one imagines.
I wonder if this is affecting staff too. Anecdotally, I know a lot of people who teach at US universities who are trying to get out.
Yes, I think being an academic at the moment is very difficult, particularly in the United States. There are challenges everywhere as academics are grappling with issues around funding, around foreign students and their status, around the change that technology is making to the way that students operate and the way that academia functions, and layering on top of that a sort of existential and practical legal crisis around the rights of academics within the US. Yes, it must be an incredibly difficult time for them.
And finally, Claudine, did you play with Lego as a child? Or perhaps even as an adult?
Yes, and now I'm excited to think about whether I need to go and actually dig out some of the old Lego sets that we have, because this piece in the New York Times is telling us that there is an incredibly valuable secondary market for rare or discontinued Lego packs, which makes them of interest to criminals. But I think all of us should take away something here. There's an opportunity for another side hustle in selling old bits of Lego that you might have put away and forgotten about. The piece tells us about someone called Shane O'Farrell, who has a Lego investing YouTube channel and made $500,000 a couple of years ago from selling old bits of Lego.
That's extraordinary. I at the moment only associate Lego with pain, because when you stand on them, it's just excruciating, isn't it?
It is very irritating, yes. I love the fact that the piece also tells us, by the way, that there is no plural of Lego. It's only ever Lego without an S.
That's so true. I'd never thought of it. Claudine Fry, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Jordan has arrested 16 members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were trained and financed in Lebanon and had plotted attacks on targets inside the kingdom involving rockets and drones. Jordanian authorities said at least one rocket was ready to be launched as part of an operation that had been under surveillance by security forces since 2021. Members of the World Health Organization reached an agreement to prepare the world for future pandemics after more than 3 years of negotiation, the organization said early today. The legally binding pact is intended to shore up the world's defences against new pathogens after the COVID-19 pandemic killed millions of people in 2020 to 2022. And US President Donald Trump threatened to strip Harvard of its tax-exempt status on Tuesday and said the university should apologise a day after it rejected what it called unlawful demands to overhaul academic programmes or lose federal grants. Meanwhile, Canadian universities have reported a significant increase in applicants from the US. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now let's join Monocle's Carlotta Rebello on the unveiling of the Olympic and Paralympic torches for next year's Milano Cortina Winter Games.
The torches made for next year's Winter Olympics and Paralympics to be held in Milano Cortina are a reminder that when it comes to design, Italy still knows how to keep things charming and comfortable. Named essential and unveiled in simultaneous ceremonies held in Milan and at Expo Osaka in Japan this week, the torches are the work of the architecture studio Carlo Ratti Associati in collaboration with Eni Versalis and the Cavagna Group, blending minimalist form with a dash of sustainability-minded engineering. Iridescent and lightweight, the burner core of each torch is visible and creates a reflective sheen that flickers with the light of the flame. The Olympic torch glows in shades of sky, a blue colour informed by Italy's ever-changing landscape, and the Paralympic one in mountains of light, a dark amber hue symbolising athletes' collective strength. Milan may be a year out from hosting the Games, but Italian design is already taking a victory lap.
And that was Monocle Radio's executive producer, Carlotta Rebello. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents around the world, do sign up for our free daily newsletter at monocle.com/minute. On April the 4th, South Korea's Constitutional Court unanimously impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol, removing him from office over his martial law declaration. He's also facing criminal trial for insurrection charges. With the presidential election set for June the 3rd, both the Democratic Party and the People Power Party have launched their primaries. Former Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung leads as the frontrunner, while multiple candidates from the People Power Party are vying for nomination. So can South Korean democracy survive this crisis, or will the deep divide between progressives and conservatives only grow wider? Well, I'm joined now by Joseph Yi, Associate Professor of Political Science at Hanyang University in South Korea. Joseph, thanks for coming on the programme. What was the public reaction in South Korea after President Yoon's impeachment?
Yes, Georgia. It's great to join you. The public reaction initially was strong division. You had celebration and relief on the progressive side, and also but shock and depression among his core conservative supporters. But after a few days, I think most of us have just moved on, and we're looking forward to the June 3rd presidential election.
And what can we expect in terms of penalties for his criminal trial that he's facing?
The main charge is insurrection or trying to overthrow the government. The penalty for insurrection is life imprisonment or the death penalty.
I wonder if you can explain to our listeners how South Korea's political landscape became so polarised between conservatives and progressives.
Korea has a long history of the politics of revenge. This goes back, even before even during the Chosun period. So you had different factions, and instead of trying to compromise, one faction would just try to destroy the other. And then you saw this after decolonization, after liberation from Japan, where the Conservative Party, they tried to, were like the anti-communist faction. They tried to imprison and sometimes execute the pro-North Korea, pro-communist factions. And so it's a constant cycle of revenge and suppression. And later, when the progressives gained power, they passed laws such as the 518 law on the Gwangju uprising to criminalize any statement that went against the progressive narrative. So there's been retaliation and suppression on both sides.
And who are the leading candidates in this upcoming presidential election? What positions are they taking on Yoon's legacy?
The leading candidate is Lee Jae-myung from the Democratic Party, and obviously he strongly criticizes Yoon's legacy, both for what he calls the insurrection, but also more broadly, he strongly criticizes Yoon's pro-Japan policies. He's realignment with Japan. So Lee Jae-myung is very critical of Japan, and he thinks that we need to bring Japan to account for historical justice. On the other hand, you have the leading candidates for the Conservative Party. They're basically very divided on Yoon's legacy, and so you have Han Dong-hoon, the former party chief, who has been openly critical. But the other candidates is basically no comment because they don't want to alienate the core conservatives who still support Yoon.
I wonder what outcome you expect for the election.
That is a really good question. Right now, I think most experts expect Lee Jae-myung to win because the conservatives are very divided on the impeachment. And so right now, this is Lee Jae-myung's election to lose. However, if the conservative candidate can move past the impeachment controversy and unify conservatives and attract some moderates, they do have a chance because the Democratic candidate Lee Jae-myung, he's also experiencing different criminal charges. So he's a very controversial candidate. And so right now, Lee Jae-myung is winning, but it depends on who the Conservative Party nominates.
Right, of course. And finally, I wonder what long-term impact might the political crisis have on South Korea's international standing and also its relations with neighbouring countries?
That is a really good question. So depending on who wins, between the progressive and conservative party candidates, there's been this wild fluctuation between South Korea's policies with respect to especially North Korea and Japan. And so you saw during the Moon Jae-in administration that relations with Japan really basically collapsed. And Japanese companies were not even enter South Korea anymore, invest, because they thought there's going to be another court ruling that's going to basically take over Japanese company properties to account for historical injustices. President Yoon has tried to go beyond this historical dispute and reconcile with Japan, and he did a famous Camp David summit with Japan, US, and South Korea in 2023. So the question is, if as likely Lee Jae-myung becomes the next president, a progressive president, is he going to build on the Camp David and the Trilateral Alliance, or is he going to pull South Korea away from Japan and away from the US and try to align more closely with North Korea and China? And so that is a central question today.
Joseph, thank you very much indeed. That's Joseph Yee. You are with Monocle Radio. Well, let's return to the US tariff story now as we examine how European car makers are responding to yet another round of possible reversals. Peter Siegel is news editor at Automotive News Europe and joins me down the line now. Peter, what is the situation with tariffs on European vehicles at present?
Well, at the present, most automakers are sort of taking a wait-and-see attitude. The EU has announced a 90-day pause on countermeasures against Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs and says it's still doing preparatory work on other countermeasures. So it's sort of in a holding pattern right now, but we have seen a few announcements from European automakers regarding pricing in the U.S., plans to locate more models at their U.S. facilities. But just to go back for one quick second, the import of the automotive tariffs on Europe is huge. The U.S. is by far Europe's biggest export market. Last year, 750,000 cars with a total value of $38 billion were sent to the U.S. from European factories, by far affecting Germany the most. Some estimates have said that, this will cost automakers billions in earnings this year. For instance, Stellantis could lose $7 billion out of an expected $9 billion euros in earnings. So this is a huge thing for them. But we've seen some announcements, and I can be a little more specific about that if you want. But the most affected European brands are Jaguar Land Rover, which sends all of its cars in the U.S., doesn't make any there. It's already announced that it's pausing exports to the U.S. So that's cars like Land Rover, Range Rover, a few Jaguars. After that, Volvo, which 90% of its U.S. sales are imported into the U.S. They have a factory in South Carolina, and they say that they plan to add a model there, but that takes time. After that, Stellantis and Volkswagen have lots of exposure, mostly because of their factories in Mexico and Canada, and they're kind of dealing with that on a North American level rather than from Europe. And then after that, it's Mercedes and BMW. Mercedes has already announced it will move a model to its factory in Alabama. And BMW hasn't said too much right now, but BMW's main issue is that all the engines for their cars that are built in the United States come from Europe. So there's a lot at stake here.
But I mean, it would then seem to be working in Trump's favor if people are relocating their factories to the US.
Well, the thing is that they haven't announced any big moves yet. Relocating an entire factory or adding a factory is a huge step, and we haven't seen that. There's nothing that I see that would indicate that thousands of jobs are about to be created in the U.S. thanks to some of these moves. We did hear Hyundai, which is a South Korean automaker, say that they were going to invest $20 billion in the U.S. Some of that was a little exaggerated, but they did say we're going to really, go all in on American production. But the European automakers so far they've been less the announcements have been less momentous. They've amounted to something, but it's not a game changer at the moment. I really do think that they are sitting back right now. The EU wants to be united in its response, if they need to do that. I mean, we heard just 2 days ago Trump say, well, we should give automotive a break. It's like, well, so we'll see.
I mean, yes, he has announced this break and that they need time to recalibrate. I wonder if he's reacting to the markets, though, because, of course, we've seen a rapid drop. Or has he only just realised that in order to bring production to the US, it will require time for the system to restructure, to recalibrate? I mean, had he really not done his homework?
Well, that's hard to say. I think what he's reacting to in the case of the automotive sector is probably pressure from the automotive companies themselves. And these are mostly the American ones. I'm not sure he's fully aware of how the European automakers operate in the United States, which is that Mercedes and BMW have enormous plants there. BMW's largest global plant is in the United States. So anything that helps BMW is good for U.S. jobs, especially it's in a red state. It's in South Carolina. So I really think some of the pressure on Trump may have come from the American companies, General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, saying, look, we use a lot of imported parts. We still have factories in Canada and Mexico. We need time. This is going to cost us jobs, and we're going to have to raise prices. I am not sure the share price of automotive stocks is a factor in this particular issue, because the automotive tariffs were announced before the so-called reciprocal tariffs. They are somewhat separate. It's a blanket 25%, except on China. But so it's a little bit divorced from those again so-called reciprocal tariffs.
Are we going to see a flood of Chinese vehicles on the market?
Well, we are not going to see that in the United States. As far as Europe goes, what's really interesting is that Europe has reopened negotiations with China. If you recall, last year, the European Union imposed additional tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. And some of those were quite punishing, up to 35% on top of the original sort of the blanket 10% on imports. So you had some Chinese brands facing 45% tariffs on their EVs, and we saw EV sales from Chinese makers went down in Europe last year. But there is a parallel negotiation track on what's known as minimum pricing, where there is a price floor on the wholesale price of cars coming in. So the idea is that Chinese automakers can't dump cheap cars in Europe, because if you look at the prices of cars in China versus the same model in Europe, it's about half for many reasons. So the EU just said, I believe at the end of last week or the beginning of this week, that they are going to reopen those talks, and that would give Chinese automakers a wider door into Europe.
So, I mean, are we seeing the demise of the European car industry? Can it be saved?
Yesterday we heard some very strong talk from John Illiken, who is the chairman of Stellantis, at Stellantis' annual general meeting, saying, look, we are in an absolute state of crisis. On the one hand, we have these tariffs that are throwing everything into chaos. And in Europe, on the other hand, we have these CO2 emissions that don't match the market reality. We just can't sell electric vehicles, and we're not going to make our emissions targets. He says it's not too late to save the European auto industry. I don't know, I could imagine that if these tariffs remain in place, that the European auto industry will be much smaller when you take away, 200,000 exports a year, if that turns out to be the case, because the U.S. market is now unprofitable. Then you will see factory closings. You might see some brands be eliminated. You might see more consolidation. The industry will have to adapt, for sure.
Peter, thank you very much. That was Peter Siegel of Automotive News Europe. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
There's a craft to every question, which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market. Working with specialized experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS. Banking is our craft.
How do we build more homes faster but without sacrificing design quality or sustainability? This is one of the key issues that RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, is trying to tackle, along with making the industry more open, inclusive and green too. Earlier, Monocle's editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, caught up with Muia Oki, the president of RIBA, to unpack the future of affordable housing, the role of young architects, and why AI won't be designing your next flat just yet.
So recently, the RIBA, we released our own report about social housing. How we believe that the government, central government, working with local government, can help deliver some of the social housing that we need. It's called Foundations for the Future. We need initial investment from central government to local authorities. Currently, central government spends about 1.2 billion a year on homelessness. For example, if that money is directly invested in local authorities up and down the country for social homes at sites that are free at the point of view, so local authorities and governments, public authorities have access to land at free at the point of use, invest that, create both market and social homes, sell the market homes, and reinvest in different sites that are free at the point of use. In our research, will contribute in creating the quality homes that we need at a pace that we need it, but also in a way that sort of gives back to the community so that you're replenishing the lost social homes that we've seen over the past few decades.
Are you surprised what your job involves? Because it is interesting, you're representing British architects, but you're doing the maths for people. You're literally kind of like working out the economics of how this could be done better.
I am learning as well as I'm going along that there is other avenues and things that you need to talk about, because we are architects, so we do the design, but also we need to ensure that the design stacks up, the viability stacks up, and I am very aware that we need to be speaking the language of the people we want to convince. So we need to input into a little bit into the economics of how we get these things going.
Do you remain hopeful then?
I do remain hopeful. I'm very, very hopeful that we can, achieve that bold, ambitious target for 1.5 million homes, but we're very, very confident, and also we talk about quality. We need to ensure that the quality of placemaking is also looked after, and that's why we are advocating about this up and down.
We did an interview yesterday with someone who's in prop tech, a venture capitalist. His view was, that you would need fewer architects, you would need many fewer people around the table making decisions, that there would be an AI person at the table who would, in his view, be able to kind of look at all the provisions you need for a building, for example, and decide whether it was good to go ahead, who could do all of the schematics in seconds. For your members, are they excited or panicked about what's coming ahead with AI?
Well, AI, as you know, is a very lively topic at the moment. And I always say, or my personal view is that if you are either a super optimist or pessimist, you are getting it wrong. We need to find a Goldilocks option. I don't believe, personally, that it's going to take everyone's job away. But also, I don't believe that if you just stick your head in the sand and hope it goes away, you will be left behind too. So we need to chart a course that is sort of middle of the road, understand where you can sort of get return on investment by actually using it. I believe there's a technical aspect in it to be sort of optimized and made a little bit quicker, make decisions a little bit quicker. But in all of that, there still needs to be someone making value judgment. And it means, hopefully, that younger architects also get a chance to make value judgments quicker. So they're working on higher value items as opposed to doing door schedules and all the mundane jobs that you hire graduates to do currently.
So it should be a liberation.
It should be a liberation, yes.
That's good, because after yesterday I thought I might go and join the Amish and kind of build everything by hand with a chisel and a mallet.
There will still be roles for that, but I don't believe that he's going to take everyone's jobs. No.
Maybe finally you could just tell us the projects here in the UK that you're seeing come past you, that your members are working on. What's exciting you in the world of architecture in the UK at the moment?
Some things that are exciting me, for example, we just coming through the new stages of our award processes. Regional awards are coming up, and we're seeing the Elizabeth Tower, the Big Ben renovated, the Wave in Sheffield, another project that's been completed has gone through the regional process. But also I was super excited about the Elizabeth line, that being completed, taking over 10 years, but also the impact like transit-oriented development has on cities like London, and hopefully we can take that and use that as sort of template for Manchester and other parts of the UK.
That was Muia Oki, the president of RIBA, in conversation with Monocle's editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck on the sidelines of MIPIM. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally today, it's time for a look at the latest stories from the worlds of fashion and retail. I'm joined for more by Rebecca Tay, a retail expert and brand consultant. Hello.
Good morning, Georgina.
Thank you for coming in. I was just telling our crew here how we met.
Yes.
Your husband who runs a lodge in Australia. It was all very odd.
Yeah, it's a very different world to fashion and retail.
But let's stick to retail right now and fashion. So slightly disappointing results coming from LVMH.
Yes, so LVMH is the first of the luxury brands to report on the first quarter, and it's definitely a soft start, to 2025. Shares down, but particularly in the fashion division. So fashion, alcohol, and its retail beauty division are the three worst hit categories. But fashion, which is led by Louis Vuitton and Dior, down quite significantly. And of course, it's sort of a bellwether for the luxury industry in general. I think with everything happening with the trade wars and tariffs, it's sort of a sign of that, obviously, as well, but definitely sort of making expectations sort of be tempered a little bit for the rest of the year.
And how much of this do you think is down to the fact that China's been having an economic crisis and that market just simply is dropping away?
Yes, definitely. They're saying that it's definitely China. It's also the US, I think, as well. Of all the markets, Europe is the only one that was actually up a little bit. I think it was up by about 2%. But definitely China, the biggest thing, I think, that's driving these results for sure, China and the US.
Let's have a look at Jean-Paul Gaultier, who is returning to the Paris Fashion Week schedule with a new creative director.
Yes, this is really interesting. I think, they've sort of had this experiment, I guess you could say, with 5 years of revolving designers. So they actually stopped showing ready-to-wear in 2014, so quite a long time ago. But for the last 5 years, its couture collections have had guest designers. So everyone from Simone Rocha to Olivia Roosting and Heider Ackerman. And then they've just announced a new creative director across both categories, so couture and ready-to-wear. And his name is Duran Lantink. He's Dutch. He's 38. He's very sort of energetic. Jean-Paul Gaultier himself sort of gave him his blessing, and he called him the new enfant terrible, which is sort of the nickname that he was given, obviously, when he was still designing. So it'll be an interesting sort of next phase for the house, I suppose.
Yeah. I know that Lantink was known for his trousers that he made for Janelle Monáe, but how would you describe his work?
It's quite sort of out there. I think his last collection, so his autumn-winter collection, was very, very sort of full of animal prints, but sort of leopard and zebra paired together. And then I think he made a lot of waves because the show opened with a female model wearing a male chest prosthesis, and then it ended with a male model wearing silicone breast prosthesis. So sort of making a statement about bodies. He's not afraid to sort of be bold, very colorful, kind of interesting body shapes for sure. So it is sort of fitting that I think he's taking over a brand that is known for that as well.
And will the brand also return then to showing ready to wear?
Yes. So he's expected to show his first outing in September. So that'll be the next spring collection, spring 2026. And he is retiring his own brand. So the collection that I just talked about with his own prosthesis and the kind of, wild clothing and animal prints, he's going to take a back seat from that for now. He has said it's maybe not forever, but it's so that he can really focus on Jean-Paul Gaultier.
Now, Coach has partnered with the WNBA, that's basketball?
Yes, it's the Women's National Basketball Association. It's an interesting one. You know, you think that sports and fashion have gone together for a long time, but this is the first official actual partnership where Coach is the official handbag of the league. So it's a little bit sort of, I was thinking about other sports brands, and you see lots of tennis stars, for example, being dressed by brands, and they all wear clothing by Nike and Adidas and, you know, New Balance. But this is the first proper fashion brand that's actually partnered with an official body in the sports world.
Is it not quite difficult to play basketball when holding a handbag?
Yeah, so presumably it's about sort of, you know, what the stars are wearing to and from the court. They are obviously stars in their own right. They've identified sort of 5 draftees, you know, all, you know, women who have kind of just been drafted to various basketball teams in the US. And Coach is really sort of trying to say as well that they're about storytelling, they're about kind of inclusivity and about sort of embracing who you are, whether that's a basketball star that's come up through, you know, very different backgrounds, or somebody who's, you know, just purchasing their handbags in somewhere in America.
And this, even though it is one of the first official sports fashion brand collaborations of its kind, to be clear, it's not what the Americans would call athleisure.
No, it's not. Yes, athleisure. It's not necessarily, no. So there hasn't been any sign that Coach will change what it's designing. They do sort of leather handbags. They've been quite big this year on TikTok and last year due to a few styles in particular. So I think it's really about kind of what the women will be wearing off the court. They're not going to be doing tracksuits or it's really not sort of athleisure in that category. It's proper handbags.
It's interesting that you mentioned TikTok. I wonder how much social media drives fashion these days.
Oh, massively. I think, you know, you see brands like Shein, I hate to say it, you know, driving kind of this whole haul culture, which is massive still on TikTok. So as much as there is a side of fashion that is becoming more sustainable and becoming a little bit more conscious, I think the TikTok and the social media generation are still very much about kind of newness and the big brands and showcasing, you know, what people are buying, what teenagers and younger kids as well actually are shopping for in the shopping centres.
Rebecca, thank you very much indeed. That's Rebecca Tay there. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Anita Riotta, Carlotta Rebello and Chris Chermak, our researcher, Francesca Gilks, and our studio manager, Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing will be live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.